Okay, so today we're going to talk about the modern American lawn, or the intermediately modern American lawn. We'll have a third lecture talking about the modern era, or the more recent era of the American lawn. So the early era kind of took place from the 1400s to 1880 or so. We talked about Beale in the last lecture. Then from 1880 to the 1920s, and I'm going to say ish on that because it's not a hard and fast number when this era takes place, but there were some significant changes during this period that we need to talk about and think about in terms of how lawns developed and what the development of those lawns were. So that's the period of time that we're going to be talking about, from 1880 to the 1920s-ish. So what was the present and main cultural practice during this period of time was scything. Okay? And prior to the development of the mower, and we'll talk about the development of the mower, basically during this early period, scything was the main practice for taking care of those lawns and fenced-in areas. The pioneer didn't have a lawnmower, even though it had been developed in the mid-1800s, early 1800s. The lawnmower didn't exist on the American frontier, and we'll talk about that as we talk about lawnmower development. So basically, most of those fenced-in areas that had taller plants, they were scythed, okay, and they were cut with a scythe. And we'll talk about the scythe with the mower development. The grasses that one could have expected to find, we've talked about the grasses, were the cool season species Festuca, Poa, and Agrostis. So this is the fescues, the blue grasses or meadow grasses, and the bent grasses. In the warm season areas out on the Great Plains and then down in the southeast, we would expect to find grasses like buffalo out on the Great Plains, buffalo grass, St. Augustine grass, and carpet grass. These are all six groups of grasses that would be reasonably able to be maintained and grazed by livestock. In addition to this, I should also mention Bermuda grass, which would have been introduced in the southern plantation areas during this time, that was also grazed pretty readily. But these would be the main grasses that you would expect to find in plantation areas and in some of the early lawns of the early 1900s. These grasses were the ones that were best adapted to grazing. And basically from 1900 to 1940, the focus in the U.S. is on this idea of gardening and landscaping. So most people now are starting to think about having homes, and in those homes they're starting to think about things other than just the basics, food, shelter, and water. They're starting to consider the idea of maintaining an outside landscape, and that outside landscape should have some gardens, both productive gardens for crop plants, but also gardens of ornamental type plants, and that the landscaping adds value and pleasure to the overall experience of having the home. One of the other things that's very clear in the early advertising and the discussions about this idea of gardening and landscaping is a focus on women's role in all of this. Women were considered the keepers of the house, and I don't mean that in any kind of derogatory sense, but what I mean is in the idea that the household economy, and the household operation, so anything from the interior of the house to the exterior house, was considered the woman's job to maintain and uphold, while the husband was out working in the factories or the fields or whatever. And so it was believed that area of the home was the job for the woman. And so in fact, the advertising from this period shows lawnmowers that are so light and easy that a single woman can push them, and all kinds of things like that show very clearly that the idea of maintaining and keeping a beautiful landscape and a beautiful lawn was solely the purview of the woman of the household unit. And so In fact, there's also a focus in some of those ads on the children, so that the woman could be outside with the children and that they could all be maintaining the garden and the landscape together. And that's an interesting view considering how it's culturally observed today. And we're going to talk about that shift in the next lecture, about how things change from the job, the landscape being the purview of the woman to the purview of the man. And that's a huge cultural shift if you stop and think about it. And that's really important in terms of the impact that turf grasses have had on lives today. So again, this idea of functional needs is still very important with this time period. The idea to maintain management of mud and dust, that there was some element of protection and security by having an open expanse of land where folks coming up to the home can be easily seen. That's an idea or an attractive idea for a homeowner, particularly if they're living outside of town on a homestead. That the idea that they can see people coming from farther off, so that if it's somebody that's up to no good, they can prepare for them before they arrive. That's really important. And then this idea of a fire break. And that's really important to consider why that might be, and we're going to talk about that more in class. But this idea of having a fire break where there's an area of ground around the home that is not readily burning material. It's not trees, it's not wood, it's not woody bushes and shrubs that could burn very easily. That those are farther away from the home, and that there's this area between that combustible material and the home that is relatively low height and low flammability that can be maintained so that it's somewhat of a fire break. Because there's services and things that we need to consider that weren't present at this time that are present today, that causes us to not even really consider that today as a functional purpose of having a lawn or an area of low height of plants for our landscape. So there's three key developments during this time that really drive the shift towards having a more beautiful, if you will, rather than functional lawn and landscape. That is the presence or the prevalence and development of clean grass seed, so grass seed that doesn't have weeds. The idea of manuring, and basically in simple terms, that's fertilizer. These were two key developments, and then the third key development is the development of the lawnmower. And we're going to talk about that in a whole set of lecture materials, so we're not going to go into that right now. But we're going to instead focus on this idea of clean seed. So up until the 1920s, sodding was the primary method of the establishment of the lawn. And we've talked about that in previous lectures. And that's generally because any of the seed that was harvested would have been threshed from a field of grass plants, a pasture, and that seed would also have all kinds of other seeds from any other weedy species that might be growing. And so this idea of having lots of weed seeds that then you would have to pick out and sort through, or you would have to rogue from your newly planted grass area, was just something that folks didn't want to deal with. So what they did is instead went to a good pasture with few weeds, and then they would cut sod. And that sod would allow the plants to grow and to creep out into areas, and that those pieces of sod were basically 100% grass plants, and so you would end up with the monoculture of grass that was desired at the time. O.M. Scott, and you might know this company as the Scott's Company, that you see commercials on even today. They're a robust, very well-managed company that deals with homeowner products, seed and fertilizer. And O.M. Scott is the primary inventor of seed cleaners that make weed-free seed possible. And this was done sometime in the 1915s. I don't have an exact date on when that occurred, but somewhere in that period of time, in the early teens, early part of the 1900s, O.M. Scott of the Scott's Company, and at the time it was Scott & Sons, developed this weed-free seed, and that was a huge improvement because now it meant that seed, rather than sod, which is heavy, could be transported to stores and moved about the country so that folks could buy a bag of seed and seed an area and establish a grassy lawn. And that was a big development in lawns and the use of lawns in society. Manuring was another thing that was also very important, and it was a very popular agrarian practice if you were on a farm as early as the early 1800s. But in urban areas where you had a home and perhaps a small lawn, this idea of manuring was not something that was really paid very close attention to. However, that quickly changed, and that it changed as a result of something that's happening on the streets and roads of cities that makes it very important for these grasses to be able to handle fertilizing. And we'll talk more about that in class, but that's just something for you to think about as we move forward. But basically, manuring is using fertilizer, using waste products as fertilizer. It improved the production of those grasses, so we had improved growth. And then around 1920, we also see the development of what we call artificial manures. And this is plant and animal byproducts as well as synthetic products. So things like blood meal, bone meal, guano, all kinds of different plant meals like soybean meal, corn meal, gluten meal, etc. were all used as artificial manures for fertilizing lawns. And then the synthetics, things like ammonium sulfate, calcium nitrate, urea, all of these things begin to be developed in the 1920s, post-World War I, basically. So as the industrial complex moves away from the previous World War, there's a need for these chemical products to be sold and find uses, and they all find uses in agriculture for the most part. So other notable things that occur during this time, Vigoro, which is a company that is still around to some extent, in 1922, the Swift company develops Vigoro, which is a fertilizer product, and that is something that you can find even today. And then O.M. Scott, that we mentioned with the weed-free seed, in 1928 develops his Turf Builder fertilizer, which is a mixture of various artificial manures like bone meal and blood meal and so on. And this Turf Builder fertilizer is designed to provide a homeowner with the ability to maintain a healthy, robust lawn, which is not unlike what the commercials of today with Scotty, the Scotsman who's selling Scott's fertilizers, is talking about when he talks about Turf Builder and its use on home lawns. So in a lot of ways, as much as things have changed over the last century in terms of turf management, or even over the last 400 years, a lot of things haven't changed. And that's a theme that we're going to start to see more and more frequently through the class. Some books begin to come out solely on lawns and their development. In 1906, the first book on lawn management is published, Lawns and How to Make Them by Barron. And this is a early book talking about how to manage and make a lawn. 1906, another book, The Lawn by Corbett, comes out later in the year. In 1911, Lawn Soils by Schreiner and Skinner come out. In 1912, Making a Lawn by Doog, Luke J. Doog comes out. And we'll look at that for sure in class. That's one of the books that's available on the Turfgrass Information Files electronic texts site. I don't know about some of these others, but I know for sure Making a Lawn is available on that Turfgrass Information site. So basically, these books are aimed at somebody who professionally or with some more detailed knowledge wants to be able to make a lawn for their home or for somebody else's home. And it's not until the 1930s that we start to see turf books that are aimed pretty solely at the general homeowner. And so these early books are more technical in their aspect, but it's still important to note that we've seen this big shift now moving from agricultural-based materials, garden-based materials where there's maybe a mention of maintaining a lawn, to now books that are coming out solely about maintaining lawns, and lawns in that context being areas of turf grasses for their use. So a pretty big shift over the last 50 to 100 years that we've been talking about in terms of the impact of grasses on lawns and their development here in America.